Good evening, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and today I'm going to do another instalment in my very slowly progressing Stories from Ukraine series. So it's a series of videos in which I try to discuss books that I've read that were written in Ukraine or by Ukrainian authors. And today we're going to be talking about Nikolai Vasilyevich Gogol. So I already recorded this video, I put it up this morning, and I was told that the sound quality was so shockingly poor that I should take it down because the washing machine was going in the background. So if you've seen the video this morning, don't bother watching this one because it will say essentially the same thing. I'm hoping in a slightly more condensed way because I rambled a lot this morning. So without further ado, let's get into the topic. So when I was looking for authors to read for this project, Gogol was a name who definitely came up a lot, and he was an author that was very interested to read. He comes from Poltava Oblast, which is an area of Ukraine that I've actually been to. One of his most well-known works was written was based around a place called Dikanka, which is a place that I've been through. I thought this is perfect. It fits together really, really well. And he's also a really highly regarded author. Rightly so. His writing has got, particularly his later writing, has got real quality to it. So I was really excited to read him as a Ukrainian author. And he's also an author that I've been intending to read more of for a while. So yeah. So I thought it fit together perfectly. Little did I know that this would prove to be maybe one of the more, I suppose, controversial authors that I chose. So the authors that I've talked about up to this point have been modern Ukrainian authors. Their books have been published since the separation of Ukraine from the Soviet Union, which occurred in 1991-ish. So they've been very definitely Ukrainian. And the interesting thing about Gogol is that he was writing in a period when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, and he has generally been seen as a Russian author. My thinking was, well, he was born in what is now Ukraine. He's an author that perhaps should be being reclaimed as a Ukrainian, and we as outsiders should be looking in and saying, we respect the fact that Gogol was Ukrainian. It's a little bit more complicated than that, I suppose. I said to some Ukrainian friends, I'm trying to read some Ukrainian authors. I'm reading Gogol, and they were like, but he's a Russian author. And I was like, but he's born in Ukraine. It's like, yeah, but he's Russian. So part of this video is going to be talking about the works by Gogol that I've read, and part of it is going to be talking about a little bit more about that debate and where Gogol sits, I suppose, in that kind of spectrum. So I've read a couple of things by Gogol for this, and the reason that I'm doing this video now, which is actually several months after reading the last thing by Gogol, is because for this month's discussing drama that I'm doing with Roz, with Scally Dambling about the books, we're going to be discussing The Government Inspector, which is one of Gogol's plays, and I wanted to get this part of the discussion out separately to that to avoid kind of clogging up that video so we get more time to talk about the play. So there's less rambling in that video. You get the rambling here. It's all good. So yes, I'll start by telling you a little bit about Nikolai Gogol, I suppose. So he was born in 1809, like I said, in Poltava Oblast. He was born to Ukrainian parents, which I suppose is an important aspect of his history. When you look at other authors who kind of sit on that boundary between being Ukrainian and being Russian from a similar era, I suppose, you get Mikhail Bulgakov, had Russian parents and was ethnically Russian, even though he was born in Kiev. With Gogol, he was, I believe, from hearing that he had Ukrainian parents, I believe he was ethnically Ukrainian, and that was a part of his history that he was quite interested in at one stage, which I will come to. His father had actually done some writing in Ukrainian language, and Gogol himself was originally educated in the Ukrainian language, which is quite important because Ukrainian, over the course of that kind of century of his life, went through varying levels of repression as a language, through varying levels of kind of political sensitivity, I suppose, and the restrictions on the use of Ukrainian varied quite a lot, but it was frequently a language which was put down, it wasn't encouraged, and it wasn't the language of that was promoted, I suppose, the language that was seen as the the dominant language at that time was Russian, because that was the language of the imperial power that was controlling the region at that time. So after his youth, Gogol then moved away from Ukraine. He moved into St. Petersburg. He spent some time working in some government jobs. He worked as a history teacher for a while. I think he worked in a girls' school. And around that time, he started thinking that he wanted to be a writer and started working on writing things. So one thing that we know about Gogol is that he really didn't like criticism. So when he set out on his writing career, the first thing he did was he wrote a wonderful epic poem, and he was so happy with this epic poem that he published it at his own expense and he circulated it, and it got picked up by a couple of newspapers and it got reviewed. And it got reviewed exceptionally badly. Gogol really, really, really didn't like that, so he bought every copy of this poem that he had self-published and he burnt them so that he wouldn't get any more bad criticism of that poem. This idea of Gogol as being somebody who's got difficulties with criticism is something that's going to crop up again later on in his life story. His next step in his writing career then was perhaps a little bit less serious. He was perhaps taking a step back and seeing if he could experiment a little bit. And he decided to do that by playing on his Ukrainian heritage and using some of those Ukrainian roots to build into his literature. And he wrote a letter to his mum saying, "Can you please remind me of some of the folk tales that were told in our area when I was growing up, because I can't remember all of the details." And his mum provided him with a bit more of the background to the peasants' tales, and that he then worked into 2 volumes of short stories, now generally known as Evenings on a Farm Near Dikanka. And these stories focus on the Ukrainian rural experience in that period when it was under the Russian Empire. So you get references to kind of broader political events. You have Catherine the Great at one point riding through in a carriage when she's inspecting her holdings, I suppose, and you also get some of the rituals and traditions of Ukrainian peasant life. You get kind of events of Christmas Eve, and romances and witches flying out of chimneys and all sorts of things like that. It's a fantastic esoteric collection of stories in one sense, but in a narrative sense, I found it quite lacking. There is often not necessarily a beginning, middle and end to the stories. You think that you're going off in a particular story direction. You might have a Cossack riding down a river with his wife, and you think you're going to get that kind of a story, and then it kind of goes off onto a tangent with a random wizard. Weird stuff happens and it doesn't necessarily have a very good flow. So I found the story slightly frustrating. What I found interesting is when I was picking up my notes to just refresh my memory on these stories, I read this paragraph and I thought I was talking about Evenings on a Farm Near Dikanka. This is my notes. The stories are generally disturbing and a bit psychedelic. Characters often don't seem quite in control of their actions. The effect can be like being on the spinning teacups ride at the fair, but the teacup sometimes spirals into wonderland. Although each story is initially rooted in reality, there is no tie to keep it within these bounds. So it turns out that those were actually my notes about Oksana Zabushko's stories. Your ad could go here. So you can kind of see that Gogol's early stories have an influence today on Ukrainian writers today, because her short stories really had that echo of Gogol's. Another way in which Gogol's stories continue to show up, I suppose, in modern Ukrainian writing is I read The Grain Store with Rosa's discussing drama back in July, I think, which is by Natalia Zorozhbit, and that is a play about the Holodomor, so a period of famine that occurred in the 1930s. And Natalia Zorozhbit, she uses a quote from Evenings on a Farm Near Dikanka, referring to the agricultural plenty of the Dikanka landscape, to then contrast that to the level of famine that occurred there during the Holodomor period. So you can see that Gogol has been taken up by and continued to be read and respected by Ukrainians kind of as time went on. Evenings on a Farm Near Dikanka was relatively successful. It made Gogol's name as an author, and it got him a certain degree of respect, but that respect was based on him being a regional author, and he was seen as being somebody from the provinces, from that that province called Ukraine that was part of the Russian Empire at that time, and not necessarily seen as kind of like one of the greats of Russian writing and Russian literature at that time. And this is, remember, he is writing in Russian, so he's choosing to write in Russian, not in Ukrainian, because he wants that Russian audience. Time goes on and he continues to write bits and pieces. He writes a few plays. He spends a while getting really interested in his Cossack history, so his Ukrainian Cossack heritage, and he writes the story Taras Bulba about a Cossack character. I haven't read that one yet. And then he starts to shift. He does a lot of traveling within Russia. He travels in Europe for a while. He spends some time in Italy, and he begins to shift his focus to being, I suppose, more of a Russian author, and his narratives kind of change to focus more on that the Russian imperialist worldview, I suppose. The next thing that I read by Gogol was his final big work, really, and that's Dead Souls. And Dead Souls is one of the classics of incomplete literature. The first volume was published in 1842. And it was supposed to be volume 1 of Dante's Inferno style, it's not Divine Comedy style set. It was supposed to be Inferno, and then he was working on Purgatorio and Paradiso, and he just couldn't get through. So Dead Souls is this kind of, really, the volume 1 is focusing on kind of like quite a bleak, dark world of moral turpitude and doubt, and Gogol couldn't quite pull together the more positive aspects of the story going on. He spent the next decade trying to work on volume 2, kept not succeeding, and eventually he sent it to he was going through sort of some spiritual turmoil at the time. He published some writings about that, and he sent his draft of volume 2 to a close friend, who then sent him back some quite severe criticism of it. Now, we remember about Gogol that he doesn't like criticism. He doesn't seem to be able to kind of deal with that in an accepting way, so he burnt the majority of volume 2. There's some scraps of it that remain. It actually ends in the middle of a sentence, and stopped eating. So it looks like he didn't eat for a quite sustained period, and he died 10 days after burning the manuscript of Dead Souls. It's unclear to what extent his death was self-willed in a way, or whether he just didn't, he was too unwell to kind of bring himself back from that. He was also visited with all of the delights of 19th century medicine, like piles of leeches and hot baths and things that probably didn't really improve his chances. So he died in 1852. So just to say a little bit more about Dead Souls then, I really loved it. What I would say is I read Anna Karenina at the start of this year, and you can really see the germs of that kind of Tolstoy era, I think it's called realist Russian literature, the germs of that beginning in Dead Souls. So Dead Souls revolves around a character called Chichikov, who is a man with a bit of a past in terms of having been involved in some kind of corruption scandals before, which we find out as the story progresses. But we meet him on a kind of a picaresque journey around Russia, not specifically specified exactly where he goes, and he kind of travels to one place and meets a few people, and then he gets led to the next place, and meets a few people and then gets led to the next place, and he is on a mission to buy dead slaves, which sounds very macabre, but what he's actually doing is a bureaucratic exercise. He's buying their names off of a tax list, essentially, to build himself up a big list of names of serfs that he owns. Ignoring the immortality of the soul, he is only interested in the name on the paper, and claiming that as a factor. So it's in many ways a Kafkaesque novel. It's about kind of bureaucracy and the neglect of the human in all of that. Kafka saw Gogol as a kind of like a kindred spirit, as a blood brother, I think was the term that was used, writing a generation previously to Kafka. And there's definitely a huge amount of influence of Gogol on later Russian authors as well, in that there is a very widely known phrase that's attributed to all sorts of different people, saying that all Russian authors came out of Gogol's Overcoat. The Overcoat being a short story written by Gogol that was published also in 1842. It's included in this Penguin collection of Russian short stories, and was seen as quite a really significant short story at the time. So the influence that Gogol had in terms of starting to form that realist style led to the kind of the development of a recognizable Russian literature. And I suppose it's one of the key factors. Another thing that happens in Dead Souls is that, well, a couple of things. One fantastic thing in terms of writing style is that it's really all about the meanders, and it's all about characterization and description and diversions. Not really a great novel for plot, but he meets different people, and it's all about Chichikov working out how to persuade different people and how to win them round to his idea of selling him these dead souls. So it's a real exercise in how to use different persuasive techniques at different points. And in Dead Souls as well, Gogol makes a lot of references to what it means to be Russian language, Russian characteristics, and he also talks about the kind of Russian imperialist agenda in terms of populating Kherson with Russian-speaking people, and he kind of buys into that as a thing and talks about that as being something that he is intending to do, to move to Kherson and populate it with his Russian serfs. Whether or not that is his actual intention is a little bit of a grey area, but definitely that fits into the kind of the political structure of the Russian Empire at that time. So I've mentioned in a slightly convoluted way that Gogol was part of establishing Russian literature and was seen as a foundation figure in Russian literature, but he's also had an influence on Ukrainian modern literature, at least. I suppose that the question that we have to ask is, Gogol was writing in Russian and contributing to Russian literature, but did he have the choice? Like, could he have been a Ukrainian writer? Could he have been contributing to the establishment of a Ukrainian-specific body of literature at that time? And the answer is decidedly yes. So in that century that Gogol was moving to St. Petersburg and working on kind of Russian-focused literature, we've got a lot of authors emerging in Ukraine who are writing in Ukrainian, who are trying to establish Ukrainian as a serious language in which, literature and poetry could be produced. Literature and poetry, you know what I mean. So there was Kotlяревsky, who wrote the Aeneida, a long poem called the Aeneida, in 1798, which was seen as the first modern Ukrainian poem. The most important would be Taras Shevchenko, who is still the national poet of Ukraine to this day. I've read a few of his poems, but they're not available really in the best translations that I found. If you know of any good translations of any of his poems, please do let me know. And in 1847, Taras Shevchenko was convicted of promoting Ukrainian independence, and he was writing, poems about Cossacks, poems about Ukrainian people doing, about the Ukrainian landscape and things. In a way that was possibly similar to what Gogol was doing with Taras Bulba, but obviously Gogol kind of diverged in a slightly different way. Later on in that decade, we also got authors like Panas Mirny, who was active around the 1880s, who was writing in Ukrainian and hiding his Ukrainian language writings from, Russian inspectors. And really, I suppose these authors were taking some personal risks in order to promote the Ukrainian language. And that was not the decision that not the route that Gogol chose to go down. So in a long-winded way, what I'm basically saying is that although Gogol was an author of Ukrainian origin, Russian was the identity that he chose for himself, and that was the place where he chose to base himself, and that was the literary canon that he chose to work within. And although there would have been a lot of complicating factors around at the time in terms of the politics of the situation and where he felt he could perhaps have the most success and not have to live undercover or not have to be part of a sort of a political struggle at the same time, I think when we're talking about Gogol as an author, it's fair to respect his decision to identify as Russian, to put it into a sort of like a modern parlance, I suppose. Anyway, to keep this under 20 minutes, let me know what you think. If you've read either of these books, please do let me know. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back soon to talk about The Government Inspector with Roz. Goodbye.